there was once upon a time a Hanseatic League, which was a league of merchant capitalist cities that organized themselves together and made something work. And I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be nice if we had a kind of a league of socialist cities? And in a funny kind of way, what we're seeing right now is Trump going after these cities. So actually, the city is now becoming an instrument of repression and a vital place of political mobilization and political organizing. Again, one of the things that's happening with socialists becoming mayors of various cities and so on, is there a way in which we can put it together and start to actually define an alternative to capital, a capitalist city, by actually saying, look, we can work at these different scales and can test at these different scales and think through the way to create a socialist city.
I first learned about Karl Marx as a teenager from my dad, which means that I've been thinking about the guy for about 15 years. And that's enough time, sure, to cobble together a kind of rudimentary understanding of some basics, even if, like me, you've been foolishly doing other things most of that time. My guest this week has not just been reading, but teaching Marx for half a century. He is steeped in it. You maybe have been one of his millions of students. I'm talking, of course, about David Harvey. And in that half century, he's not only been teaching Marx and making diagrams to explain Marx's theory, something very close to my heart, but has also been pushing the frontiers of Marxism itself to expand into questions of space and cities and how those impact the development of capitalism. Socialist cities, you might have noticed, are having a bit of a moment right now, what with Zohran Mamdani having been elected as the mayor of New York. And so I wanted to sit down with David Harvey and find out what he makes of the new leader of this city he calls home, and whether in his 50 years of teaching about Marx and capitalism, hadn't he sort of suspected that capitalism kind of might be over by now? David Harvey, welcome to Do Your Own Research. I want to begin with the question of this new book, right? The new book is called The Story of Capital. And at the very beginning, you say that what we're going to be doing is we're going to be mapping capitalism's domain. That's something that we're trying to do here as well. There's a kind of a proliferating, almost kind of sprawling collection of things that we're trying to stick together and understand together. How does one do that? What is the first step in that process of understanding the vast global system of capitalism, and how have you approached that question sort of, through many books before, but also crucially through this new book now?
Well, I think the answer to that is you approach it by getting a very good idea of what the concept of capital is and how capital gets used and how the systemic system that grows up, which we call capitalism, which, by the way, is a term that Marx, as far as I can tell, never used.
Right.
He always used the word capital's mode of production.
Yeah.
And so what I set out to do was to try to give a picture of capital's mode of production, because that's the engine, if you like, which drives everything. There's all sorts of other things going on. But you can't get very far understanding capital without understanding its mode of production. And so my aim was to give a picture, if you like, of the mode of production of capital.
And we have, on screen, people now can see the diagram that opens the book, yes, in its sort of new reproduction. This is a sort of immense construction, right? This is the sort of the attempt to produce a view of that totality. And we'll come back to this diagram later and sort of ask questions about it. But how did this diagram develop over the course of your life, right? This is an ongoing project that has had many iterations. What is new? What is different about this one?
Well, I had been teaching capital since 1970, and some years I was teaching it 3 times a year, and and I was needing some sort of picture, if you like, that people could relate to, and so understand where they were in the whole process of circulation of capital. So it looks very complicated, but in fact, it's fairly simple. That capital, the mode of production, you can start anywhere, but the easiest place to start is somebody holding money, and so capital is first appears in money form, and then the capitalist takes that money form and goes and buys commodities. And there are two kinds of commodities: there are means of production and labor power. And then the capitalist then puts those two things together and makes a fresh commodity, which is then taken out into the market and sold in the market for the initial value plus an augmentation through profit, and then it recycles again. In other words, this is a cyclical kind of process, and it keeps on going. And capital takes many forms. At one point, it appears as commodities. At another point, it appears as money. At another, it appears as a labor process. So it has Marx's term is totality. You look at the totality, and you see these different moments within the totality, and then he kind of defines capital as value in motion. So what he's doing is, what Marx is doing, is trying to set up a theory of value in motion, which is going to talk about all these elements and say we can understand capital by seeing the way the circulation process operates.
And that's obviously in some ways quite methodologically particular to Marx, although the way in which you described it there could well be the kind of ways in which, say, a systems theorist or a complexity economics framework approaches the question. But there is something that is sort of different about Marx's method, which is that it's a method of proceeding through contradiction and dialectical thought. Like, how do you get that into a diagram? Like, how do you take the question of the dialectic and take the question of contradiction and tension and turn it into this? Because from looking at this on a sort of first glance, you'd think, well, this is all functioning quite smoothly. It almost looks like a computer ship diagram. And the computer ship, there are different parts, but they all work in concert together. How do you represent the crisis tendency within capitalism in this kind of form?
Well, the reason why Marx is so special is that his definition of capital is value in motion. It's a process, it's not a thing. Whereas in bourgeois economics, capital is an asset which is utilized, so it's a thing. So in a sense, it's a mechanical model that the bourgeoisie works with, whereas Marx is working with an organic model in which the most important thing is the process. And I always ask students this. I said, "No, do you live your life as a process or as a thing?" And of course, when people say, "Oh, well, yeah, I guess I live it as a process." And the process side is very different from the thing side. So yes, you could take these categories and say, oh, we're going to convert them and look at them as things. But the point about this diagram is that at no point does capital remain stationary. It's constantly in motion. And it is moving through these different forms. So at one point it's appearing as money form, and at another point it's as commodity, another is being taken into market and sold. So Marx's definition is radically different from bourgeois economics in general, and it is that difference which I think starts to make sense to people, because when you ask them, do you live your life as a thing or as a you are treated as a thing by the state, but you live your life as a process, and therefore we should concentrate on the process side of things rather than on the thing side of things.
And the moments where Marx talks about sort of being dot-like punctuality,
Yes.
right? Like kind of a moment of being reduced to this sort of increment or this kind of unit of something, rather than having that full human processual life. And I guess that's not the core perhaps of the critique, but it's a moment of the critique in the way in which capitalism subjects labor, so they feel like a dot, or you feel like you are this simple moment in not a thing in process.
Yes, when you go to register in Social Security or something like that, you are really put in the position of being a dot-like thing, making claims of certain kinds. Whereas Marx is kind of saying we have to look at the process, whereby the value that you create and the value you use in your life is perpetually in motion. So, his definition of capital is value in motion. And it's the motion part which is absolutely critical. And you don't get that in bourgeois economics. Bourgeois economics engages in something which we call comparative statics. That is, you take a picture, as it were, of what's going on in the economy in 1945, and then you take one in 1950, and you then look at the relationship between the two. So it's comparative statics, and you have no idea exactly of the process which takes you from 1945 to 1950 to 1990 and so on.
There is a question of the I think you're absolutely right to characterize bourgeois economics of some schools in that way, but there are new ways of thinking about the economy, right? For example, the Santa Fe Institute has done a lot of work in attempting to produce complexity economics, and which they would argue has the same kind of emergent contradiction, self-destructive properties that appear in Marxist framework as well, right? It's not sort of this question of time, right? This question of process isn't entirely unique to Marx. So maybe you think it is. I mean, is there anything we can learn from that particular school of bourgeois economics that takes complexity and time and transformation and change and destruction and contradiction seriously? Or do you think if it did take that seriously, it would simply become Marxism?
No, I think if there are certain times when the economy is working well and everything seems fine, then the two systems look as if they are compatible with each other. But then you have a crisis of some kind, and typically, as Marx kind of says, when there's a crisis, the economists typically argue that there could not be a crisis if only the economy performed according to their textbooks. So Marx we then ask the question. I mentioned this kind of circular kind of process, continuous, and one of the things we can say about it is that it has to produce a surplus, and that therefore the thing is driven by profit. And if it's driven by profit, it is therefore expanding. It is therefore an expansionary system, and it is that expansion which we see around us. For example, the total capitalist economy in, say, 1950 was equivalent to something like $9 trillion. It is now over $100 trillion. So the expansion. And Marx kind of says there's a difference between a cyclical process and a process which is about a spiral. And this system is a spiral. It's going to grow over time. It is evolving. It's perpetually in change. And that, again, is something which is, I think, very special to Marx. And the kinds of terms that he relies upon are terms like contradiction. For instance, you can read through capitalist economics and you don't find the word contradiction at all, whereas for Marx, it's a profoundly important word. And we have to deal with contradictions, and we have to do what Mao suggested, which is we have to start to think about what are the primary contradictions within this system, which leads it not to equilibrium, which is what the classical political economist did, but leads you to disequilibrium, and at some point or other becomes an engine for crisis formation. So those are the sorts of issues that Marx tries to analyze, and that's what is going on inside of this diagram. If you imagine, a drop of capital circulating round and round and round in this system, it goes on and on and on, and it creates a spiral form. And there's a big difference between a spiral and a cyclical system. Cyclical system is like day and night, The spiral is something which is going to grow and expand and take new forms and build new insights.
We'll come back to the question of the sort of the question of limits, right? Which is perhaps your most sort of famous book, The Limits to Capital, right? The question of whether or not there are limits, or there's simply a sort of ongoing, endless process of further capital accumulation and so on.
Yes.
But I want to get to one of those very contemporary instantiations over here. I mean, you are the world's most famous Marxist geographer, but you are also a New Yorker. I'm assuming you voted for Zoran Mondani. I don't know. Maybe that's a personal question that people can't can't ask. Tell us about Zoran as a figure, because the other aspect of your work we haven't quite touched on yet is this question of the right to the city. You have an excellently clear and very famous article called "The Right to the City" as a kind of frontier of struggle, right? At the point where lots of people, increasingly many people, perhaps even the global majority now, live their lives, which is in and through cities. Can you just explain to us what is the project of the right to the city? And do you think that Zoran Mamdani furthers that project? How do you see him relating to that project? Or is this sort of a separate, secondary thing that to that much broader political goal?
Well, I don't know if he's read my stuff and I can relate to it. I have to ask him about that. For me, I think the interesting thing is to say, well, what kind of point in the circulation of capital is he really concentrating on? And of course, all of this thing about affordability. But when you look at affordability and you look at the circulation of labor capacity, you find that is a consumption problem. And actually, the socialist perspective that he's bringing to the administration of the city is very much about the city as a consumption object and improving the consumption capacities and all the rest of it. It's a kind of a consumerist socialism. He doesn't go on about the working class in the way that traditional Marxists did, and I'm not saying he should. In fact, I think this concentration on affordability is a very interesting initiative on his part. In other words, I learn from him rather than him learning from me when it comes to positioning this thing. But if you look at something like what's going on in housing markets, you see that actually more and more people are being shunted out of the capacity to have a decent life and a decent living environment and a decent house. And therefore, something about the consumer side of life has become critical, and many people are relating to it, and so to the degree that it has a popular resonance, but it is a very specific approach to how to understand the circulation of labor capacity, and what part of that circulation is the part that he is mainly concentrating on. And I think it is the point of consumption, which I think is underestimated in a lot of Marxist literature. In fact, I was thinking of writing something on this just to make sure that people got the point, that we have a theory in Marx which very much concentrates on the labor process and is very much about production and so on, whereas the consumerist side is left to some, in traditional Marxist literature, it was often left to one side entirely. It's never been left to one side in my own work. I've always wanted the consumer part to be significant. And the right to the city is the right to have a living environment which is adequate and which is satisfying and which can be sustainable in the long term.
I think I think you'd be surprised at how much he's read. I imagine that he's probably read your work at some point. So I think there's it goes two ways. I imagine I've no insider information on this question. Do not quote me. But I think that you'd be surprised at how much he's probably read. Maybe. You talked about these different sort of moments, right? So you have the kind of the moment of production, the moment of consumption for the worker, right? We're thinking about a single individual worker. And I want to think about that question of totality that you brought in earlier with Marx. How does that make us think differently about strategy? Because in some ways we are trying to stitch together the demands that the worker makes at the moment of production, the demands that the worker or the consumer of housing, right, which is more than workers, but sort of the proletariat more broadly. The moment of the labour market as well, which has its own individual internal tensions. Does a successful socialist strategy rely on always keeping in mind that totality? Or perhaps, given the success of Zoram so far, do you think there are times at which you can push on just one, on just, say, this kind of consumerist socialism, as you called it, and then get a very long way? Or do you need to keep in mind that totality? And if so, how, right?
Well, I think you always, for me, I always try to keep in mind the totality. And then there are moments in which a certain part of that totality becomes the center of contestation and the center of struggle. Now, when I set up this circulation of labor capacity, you say the laborer actually lives in a world where they take on very different roles, and depending upon where they are, the role is going to dictate very much how their political consciousness arises. So if we take it as a given that political consciousness arises out of the experience of daily life somehow, then you'd ask the question of well, what does the ordinary person living in the city think about? Now, if we think about them simply as laborers in a labor process, we get certain kind of ideas about, well, trade unions we should organize and we should try to change the structures of production and so on. But the capacity to labor depends upon living in a family or a reproduction unit of some kind. So at that point, the laborer is experiencing something very different. They're at home, they're at rest, they're playing with the family or whatever, and so they have a different consciousness of the world from that moment of consumption. And the same thing is applied very much in terms of money. That when the laborer gets their wage, they have money power, and they can use money power as money and do what they like with it. Nobody can instruct them exactly what to do. But nevertheless, what the bourgeoisie can do is it can raise it can raise wages and increase wages, but then win it back by setting up means of extraction of the value from what happens in the market. Now, in this instance, what we have is a very interesting thing that, for example, take something like credit card and the extraction of value through use of credit cards. And we all use credit cards, and we all kind of are, so our consciousness is very much about, well, what's going on with the credit card companies? Why are they taking so much money from us? And actually, some people can get higher wages and then lose their wages because they get caught up in credit card debt. And so there's something going on there in credit card debt that the working people experience, but that's very different from being in the labor process. And what we've got right now is a situation in a city like New York, where a large number of people are in fact debt bound, and in fact this leads them to sort of have a political consciousness and say, Elizabeth Warren, please change those credit card arrangements, please. Those sorts of things come up, and then you kind of say, well, part of the socialist agenda would be to deal with credit card, because the credit card has become crucial to working class consumption habits. And at the same time, credit card is a way of extracting value from working people, but not from the labor process, but from the fact that they have to use credit cards to be able to put food on the table on Thursday before they get paid on Friday. This is the sort of thing where the understanding of the labor process and the circulation process of this kind helps, I think, understand how political consciousness arises, because we may see people saying, well, I'm not very happy in my labor process, but on the other hand, it'll do. What really is bothering me is housing prices. because they're not finding a place to live, so that you move to a different part of the circulatory process, and that becomes the issue. And what Mamdani has done is isolated a set of issues which are crucial to daily life and don't actually affect the labour process too much. But it's interesting. One of the first things he faced when he came into power was a strike by nurses. So suddenly the labour process side of things, and now what is he going to say about the labour process side of things, and how is he going to handle that? He's mainly concerned, of course, with affordability, but this is not affordability. This is sort of addresses affordability by raising wages. And I think that one of the things that I point out in the book, and I'm very strong about, is that wage repression has been one of the key features of the capitalist economy over the last 30 or 40 years, and it continues to be a very serious issue, and that therefore addressing wage repression is, to me, terribly important. But I'm not going to say to Mamdani, hey, you shouldn't be talking about housing prices, you should be talking about wage repression. But I think that somebody who looks at the whole thing would say that wage repression is part of the trigger for the problems that exist.
Well, would you imagine that you are placed in the Mamdani team? Doesn't seem implausible to me. I'm sure you're very busy otherwise, but like, imagine that you are placed in there. What would you have him do? Like, what would be the front that you would open up? What would be the view that you would give him? What would be the insight that you think that you could contribute to that campaign to make a New York that considers, or a New York administration that considers not only this kind of supply side and consumption questions, but also the question of the labour process, also the question of things beyond affordability? Is there one thing that you would have him do?
Well, I mean, he is in a position to mediate, if you like, a labour dispute, and I think that he should. That's one possibility. Now, I'm not going to sort of sit in the armchair and kind of dictate policies as to what he should or should not do. I think I rely very much upon, he's a very creative guy and thinks things through on his own, and that's good. All I would ask, but there are many ways in which he can use the mayoralty as a way to intervene positively towards in labour disputes, and I'm sure there are going to be many such disputes occurring during his mayoralty.
Yeah, and the other sort of like thing that is looming over New York right now is, of course, the ICE, right, and the attempt to sort of threaten migrant workers, or indeed even U.S. citizens who are Hispanic or non-whites, right, in some way, or even people who are just opposed to the authoritarianism of ICE. That creates this process we have in the middle here, which is the competition in segmented labour markets. How do we understand from a sort of Marxist perspective what the function of ICE is as an organisation?
It's not a good idea to talk about ICE in terms of labour market too much. I mean, they're turning into the brown shirts of the Trump form of fascism, if you like to put it that way. And I mean, therefore, one of the things we need to do is to figure out ways to confront the politics that have come down to us by Trump and what is going on, and this is, of course, a global problem because the active right wing is intervening in segmented labour markets in certain kinds of ways. It's using the segmentation, which is anti-ethnic and anti-class. And it's using that as a vehicle to try to control and suppress the labour force and its capacity to fight off wage repression. So if you look at the history of wage repression in New York City since the crisis of the 1970s, you would say that this is one of the things that needs to be addressed. And Mamdani is not in a good position to address that on his own, obviously, or take a leadership position. But I'm sure he'd be very sensitive to things like, you know, labor troubles and what's going on with Amazon and what's going on with these other employers that are actually fostering wage repression. But he also has to understand, and everybody has to understand that if you fight against wage repression and wages rise, if wages rise but the cost of living rises even more, then we're better off. So that's why you have to look at the totality. And I'm very nervous about strong movements about raising the minimum wage and saying the minimum wage should be $20 an hour or something of that kind. And you say, yeah, but if all of the landlords raise rents by that amount, then that merely keeps you where you are. So this is the kind of mode of thinking where you need to have a kind of across the board politics which recognizes the importance of segmentation in labor markets and how that has worked historically to the detriment of labor in general, and how it's now being mobilized in a very distinctive white nationalist right-wing kind of way. And again, it has to be fought off in the labor markets themselves. It's one part of the consciousness of the laborer, is what their experience is in the labor market. What's their experience in the credit card company? What's their experience in the supermarket? What's their experience in the living space? All of those things are important, it seems to me, in forming the political consciousness of the working population.
The other perhaps big movement that's kind of come out in the last couple of years that's been very prominent in American discourse, apart from obviously Trumpism and the resurgence of the left of the Democrat Party, is the attempt to move the Democrat Party sort of center ground towards what is often called abundance. So the figurehead of this is Ezra Klein, also from New York. Well, not from New York originally, but a famous New York Times journalist. How do we understand what the abundance people are trying to do? They call it supply-side progressivism. The idea is that there's been this proliferation of forms of regulation that have essentially produced too many veto points inside the development of cities. A lot of your work concerns the development of cities, the process of destruction or creative destruction that is necessary to make and remake cities. How should we understand the kinds of political economy of someone like Ezra Klein?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things where, my mother had a phrase that said basically, you can do what you like, but everything in moderation. and actually, it sort of works a bit. And I think that there are situations in which the abundance is there, it's being produced, but the problem is that the effective demand has not kept up to be able to absorb the abundance. I mean, I'm theoretically in the book, I'm very much talking a lot of the time about overaccumulation, about the plethora of capital, and that surpluses of capital are terribly important, and it's very hard to get them absorbed. So one of the ways in which, Henry Ford was interesting this way. When the slump came in 1929, Henry Ford kind of said, I'm going to increase the wages of my workers because they don't have enough money to buy my cars. And until I get that situation, I'm going to be in difficult times. So, yeah, there is a moment there where the superabundance can be channeled into something which is positive from the standpoint of the standard of living of labor. The trouble is that a lot of the surpluses of capital do not get channeled in that way. They get channeled in different ways. We're leaving aside the absorption of large mass of it by the billionaire class. You have a lot of surplus which is being absorbed in things which are, to me, rather secondary. For example, it's interesting, over the last 30 or 40 years, all the major sports have been capitalized. So they're big capital now. soccer, they're huge. And how much do you pay a star? They're getting millions and millions of dollars, and what's being fed to the population is a spectacle. And the famous line about spectacles hides extortion. So this spectacle it becomes, we're in a Netflix economy, and we're in a spectacle economy, and huge amounts of money are going into it. How much is spent by the National Football League? How much is spent by the soccer teams? It's so yes, you can say there is an excess, and there is always an excess there. And one of the things that capital does is to try to make sure that the excess is consumed in a way which is not going to actually improve the conditions of life and living of the working people. And so, for example, the state will build a new soccer stadium or a new NFL stadium. Look at how many stadiums have been built. And is this the kind of a way in which we want abundance to be organized? And my answer to that is no, we don't want that. We want the abundance and the overaccumulation to be channeled into something which is actually going to improve the daily life of the citizens in the street, in education, healthcare, and the like, rather than in entertainment. And you kind of say, if you look at the economics of a Taylor Swift event, then yeah, the surplus is there. So I think the Kleins are right to concentrate on the surplus, but to talk about ways of how the surplus can be utilized to improve the conditions of life of the mass of the population. And in that sense, progressive liberalism can actually match with a sort of social democratic socialism, so that there can be an alliance of forces around those questions. But be careful, because the fact that there's a surplus and the fact that the surplus is put into building a new baseball stadium is not a good idea. The surplus is going to be used to build clinics in rural areas and things like that. Then you can say, well, no, this is a positive use of it.
I guess they would say that their main focus is on things like high-speed rail, on energy infrastructure, particularly green energy infrastructure, and on housing, which all seem like they probably neatly dovetail with this. I guess a different critique here is that the doing this inside the broadly neoliberal economic structure simply ends up benefiting the construction companies, possibly who are they able to, at scale, drive down wages, command better prices on the market, and therefore construct lots of either quite low quality or very expensive housing. But there is a kind of a way in which these things match onto the left, or do you not see that?
Yes, no, I think I worked in housing and things like that when I was in Baltimore a lot, and there are situations where you can manage to make life better for 5% of the population, and then people would say, "Yeah, that's trivial," and I would answer, "Well, if you can make it better for 5% of the population, you should do it, because 5% can become 7%, can become 8%." So I'm the progressive movement, if you want to call it that, which is not explicitly socialist, and I think the tradition of Marxist thinking is always to be concentrating on the labor process rather than on living conditions in the city. And my own work has been very much, as you know, about urbanization and what goes on in urban life, and I consider that a fundamental part of what class struggle is about. So for me, when Mamdani takes on the housing in the way he's doing, I kind of applaud that. I think that's it's a consumerist issue, and we need to take care of it. But to take care of it in a way which is beneficial to the mass of the population. For instance, take housing. There's a lot of housing being built around, but nearly all of it is upper middle class and condos for the ultra rich and so on. And right now, even Trump has got the idea that he ought to curb billionaires going in and buying up housing and turning it into rent
Yes.
stock.
Which I found. I mean, I so I think the precise proposal is that asset owners shouldn't be able to, or corporations more generally even shouldn't be
Right,
able to buy
right.
single-use houses, so houses with
Yeah,
one
right.
family in. Is that surprising to you? Because that was surprising to me.
Yeah, well, it was surprising to me, and I thought to myself, "My God, I think that's a good idea."
I mean, the precise line that he used was something like a house. People live in houses, not corporations,
Yes, right.
which I think literally might be a Xi Jinping quote. Like the house is for living in, not for speculating, I think is the Xi
Yes,
Jinping quote.
right,
And
right.
there is this. I mean, this is. Are we seeing a kind of American populism that relies on the basic ideas of a Chinese capitalism, socialism hybrid object? Like, are we seeing
Well,
a sort of
I
transference
think
here?
it's really interesting that when Xi Jinping started to talk about common prosperity spheres
No.
and that, and kind of said there are three mountains to climb. One is the mountain of available housing, the other is the healthcare, and the third is education. And I thought to myself, if we had a political party in this country that said we are solely going to be concerned with those three items and we're going to sort them out so that they actually are organized to benefit the mass of the population, I mean, that would be a hell of a thing, right?
I mean, yeah. I mean, not that I. I mean, maybe I don't know. I'm reserving judgment on the question of the Chinese Communist Party for.
Well, he'll pervert it, and I'm not sure he's going to be serious about it. But the thing is, there are things like that. I mean, putting a barrier between
Mm,
billionaire speculation in housing markets, because they actually benefit from increasing housing prices,
yeah.
and so they have no incentive to try to bring the housing prices down. So
This
that,
is yeah. Absolutely. So this is what I wanted to get to. I wanted to get to this sense that inside the abundance movement there is this contradiction, right,
yes,
between people who wish to expand the housing stock because they think that would be sort of good for everyone, even if it's relatively low quality, even if it's luxury housing, right? Both of these would be sort of opposite ends of the bad spectrum. And then there's this tension with the house owning middle class, right,
yes,
who actually benefit from the scarcity of housing itself.
yes,
So it's very difficult to locate a constituency of
yes.
people apart from those who are sort of ideologically driven towards this, right?
Well,
People who, yeah,
that's a typical contradiction,
right, yeah,
which is why you need the concept of contradiction, and you can't do without it.
right, yes, yeah, yeah. I mean, like, I think this question of the competition with China as well among American progressives is going to become increasingly interesting over
Yes.
the next few years. Is America really going to be able to compete with China? Right? Is a really ongoing question. Maybe, I mean, that's a very generally posed question, but what are your thoughts on this question of America's ability to compete with China, given all its structural problems and given the extraordinary growth rates of Chinese capitalism?
Yeah, well, I've been in China three times, and have to say I'm incredibly impressed by what they are doing in the way of high-speed rail networks and everything, complete building of new cities and all the rest of it. I was very impressed, but for mainly health reasons, I haven't been able to go there in the last 4 or 5 years, and it's so I don't know quite what to make of all of the things. The only thing I do know from the little that I have studied it is that you should never count the Chinese out.
Right.
They are very, very fast and do things, and I mean they build a high-speed rail network in about 5, 10 years.
Yeah.
They're still struggling to find some way to get from Los Angeles to San Francisco, in this country. So, they're really quite extraordinary. And there is a myth that everything is determined at the center. It's not. It's a highly decentralized world. The party proposes, and then the regions and villages and all the rest of it proposes,
Hmm.
and
Almost like a market for governance. Or,
yes, and
yeah.
they and they get a lot of things wrong. Don't get me, we get into this thing of oh well, they're super magicians. Well, they are pretty good, and I think the United States is actually right now, much of the Trump policy is actually weakening the United States' position in relationship to competition with China. No question about that. And I think that, look at what happened. They took a company like Huawei and they tried to emasculate it. And now it's turned up as to be one of the big kind of companies in artificial intelligence. They can switch things around quickly. And of course, the state is meshed in all of this. And so I'm thinking that over the next few years, China is the place to watch, and I hope that they don't get into the whole competition of military hardware and all the rest of it, which I find very distressing. And I think that that's the sort of way of dealing with surplus capital, as Marx says about military expenditures. It's like tipping value into the sea. And there's been a lot of tipping value into the sea since 1945. I mean, I made the argument in the book that the
Yep.
two means by which the surplus was absorbed after 1970 or so, the two ways were military expenditures and a lavish kind of urbanization that was largely about spectacle rather than about making life decent for the mass of the population. So this is a problem.
Yes, I have the. It was sort of just off camera there on the diagram, but we have the military-industrial complex sort of circulating around all our thoughts here on this Chinese question. I mean, there are these people who will say, and I think it's probably almost certainly correct. I mean, I think you have the statistic in your book, which is that in the 3 years between 2011 and 2013, China used as much concrete as America did in the 20th century. So we do have this enormous problem of both ecological limits and quite possibly of overaccumulation or overcapacity. The vast building of cities in which no one lives, and so on. Of course, the idea of a socialist planning system is that you try not to run into those problems. But as China has liberalized, right, it has run into exactly the same set of problems that would have happened in America as well. Although there's an undersupply of housing in America.
And in certain Chinese cities, there's an undersupply of housing in
Right.
Shanghai and Beijing, and it's most of the excess of housing was in the sort of second and third and fourth tier cities, as I understood it, and we often say, well, they built estates where nobody was living. Well, that was true maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But it ain't true now. So again, you have to be careful what truth you come up with, because there was a time when that was the case. The ghost cities were around, but they've largely been absorbed, as I understand it.
Yes, yeah, that's my understanding as well. I mean, I'm bullish on China. I think it's going to be the place to go, the place to be. I'm currently trying to learn Chinese. Are you?
No, but as you know, I was a very close friend of Giovanni Arrighi, and Giovanni used to say there were two big things that he really regretted about his life. One was that he'd never learned to play the piano, and the second was that he hadn't learned Chinese.
I also can't play the piano very well, and but I would like to be able to do that as well. Maybe also karate. I don't know. I've got a whole reams of unfulfilled ambitions, but
Yes.
hopefully I'll be fulfilling them. Let's talk about Arrighi, because you have this great quote, which I want to actually get up on the thing. Marx's open concept of totality is, as an ever-expanding ecosystem, invites consideration of contingencies, the internal mutations, the innumerable seeds of alternative practices. So we have this idea of the open totality, the sense that even though, and this is what's very attractive about this diagram, right, is that it seems to map out everything. Of course, there are these contradictions, but nevertheless, as we've already sort of alluded to, there are the questions of race in the segmenting labor market that don't necessarily sort of fall into this one diagram. And the project of this show, I should say, is trying to sort of expand this diagram endlessly in all directions. At some point, people can see the whole thing. But let's talk about...
of course. What I did in the book was to say, look, I'm really concentrating on capital's mode of production.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that mode of production exists in a certain context, which I call the capital's social formation.
Yeah.
And what Marx is mainly concerned with is the mode of production, not the social formation. But occasionally he runs off and talks about the social formation. I tried to follow that a little bit by kind of saying that, when we're looking at labor markets and we're looking at different labor markets in different parts of the world, different segmentations in some labor markets. Women are not allowed and don't have access, and others they do. So the labor markets can vary a great deal. But that is all in the social formation and the fact that there's repression of women and the failure to mobilize their labor is a contingent fact in the social formation. So I'm very aware of the fact that what I'm doing is a kind of simplification of what goes on in the labor markets, but I leave it open to say, well, labor markets can be organized in all kinds of different ways. And I did a lot of reading about 19th century and the hiring halls in cities like Manchester and so on were terribly important institutions. The same thing applied in France and so on. So I don't want to get to the thing that it's all tightly wrapped up, because it's not tightly wrapped up. There's a huge variety of labour market situations, and, even within a country. Like the labour market in Alabama is, I'm sure, very different from the labour market in Connecticut.
Which is also, to go back to our earlier discussion about ICE, one of the things they've been doing, right, is to go to places where there are informal day markets for labour. You have a construction project, perhaps you hire 3 people who are migrants to the US and hire them for one day, and then they have to go back again. And these are the places that ICE has been, in part, targeting, not just the city, but the kind of peripheral zones where people congregate in order to participate in the labour market in these informal ways. Let's talk about Arrighi. You, as you say, great friends with Giovanni Arrighi. What did you learn from him? Because when you're thinking about this open totality, or think about this totality that can always have these new contingent or different parts, or goes through different kind of phases of capital accumulation, which is part of Arrighi's main contribution. What did you learn from him as a interlocutor and as a friend?
His deep commitment to something called the longue durée.
Yeah.
And that you could look at what's going on around us now, and I would be in a seminar and I'd be waxing forth about what's going on, blah blah blah, and then Giovanni would intervene and say, well, now you've got to look at the longue durée and all this thing, and what you see in the longue durée is that something different is happening than what you're thinking. So this was a regular occurrence in the seminar. And I felt he was right, but you don't kind of turn it into a mechanical thing. That's why I think it's the evolutionary process that he thinks about, and the absorption of certain aspects of the state, for example, is absorbed into capital, and the state at a certain point becomes capital, and that's always possible. But it's also possible for it to loosen its chains to capital and do something different outside of capital. So his approach to the state and so on was always against the background of this longue durée.
Did you ever, before that, you started, as you said earlier, working on teaching capital in the 1970s. Did you ever, perhaps before your Limits to Capital book, did you ever think, okay, well, it'd probably be over by 2026, capitalism as a social whole, or did you always have that long, centuries-long process in mind?
I think, well, I was educated, if you can call it that, as a historical geographer. And historical geography
Yeah.
is, to me, really very interesting because, you know, you see these things changing and things get left behind. I would be wandering around in rural Suffolk and you find this late medieval church, which is actually a product of the wool trade with Flanders. And I always appreciated that side of things. And I would bicycle around the local uh, area and find myself suddenly confronting a sort of an old barn that came from about 1100. And so I was the historical geographer was always there in my thinking, and it became very strong, of course, when I took on the whole kind of Paris book, which was very much about a historical moment and transformations occurring. But again, I was very emphatic about what are the processes at work which make the Paris Commune of 1871 so different from the revolution of 1848. What happened in between? And what was the process that changed the world under Louis Bonaparte? So I've always been interested in that, and I had some good conversations with Giovanni because he was talking very much about kind of the Italian city-states and Amsterdam and so on. So we were very close on all of that.
You're talking about the period of Haussmann's reconstruction
Yes,
of
yes,
Paris, then,
yes.
right? Do you see similar dynamics? Because part of your reading there, as far as I understand it, is that this is about the attempt to absorb the surplus capital, right, into the physical construction of Paris. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Do you see a similar move? And I was going to make this analogy earlier, but do you see, when we're thinking about the abundance people, a similar kind of demand from them to work out what to do with the massive overaccumulation of capital and find profitable enterprises? Is that another way in which we can read the political economy of Ezra Klein?
Yeah, I think so, but I think it's very important to understand where the surpluses are coming from and why they are being produced in the way they're produced, and what kinds of surplus what kinds of mechanisms are being devised to absorb the surpluses. I mean, for example, one of the arguments Marx made, and which has always stuck with me, is that in difficult times, the capitalist resorts to forms of production which are instantaneous in terms of their consumerism. In other words, the turnover time of capital is reduced as far as you possibly can to something close to zero.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look, you kind of say, well, since over the last 40 years, the monetization of spectacle and the actually selling of experiences rather than commodities, and the commodification of experience has become a very important part of our lives. And so we now live, I came to political consciousness in 1950s, and what I look at now is Netflix and all these things, and it's a society of spectacle doubled down on. But the thing about spectacle is that it's all over. Just to give you an example, I'm fascinated by the economics of cruise liners.
Okay. Tell me.
I mean, it's a vast amount of capital gets invested
Yeah.
in a cruise liner. 3,000 people there as labor force, 3,000 or 4,000 people are there as joyriders, and it's all over in a week, and they can go to the next cruise. So, for instance, it's so interesting to hear Trump talking about bringing work back to the United States, and one of the things that that he emphasizes all the time. He's always talking about manufacturing.
Yeah.
Well, one of the big shifts has been tourism. Tourism has been one of but what tourism is about is the absorption of capital over a very short period of time for about a week or something like that, while somebody goes and sits on a beach, something like that. So tourism has become huge, but Trump doesn't talk about tourism. And of course, there's a big problem now, right? By taking these people out of the labor force, the labor force that typically looks after tourists when they come to town is being essentially diminished.
Yeah.
So Trump is doing all the wrong things if he really wanted to get the economy right again. But it was interesting. And when COVID came, tourism stopped. The number of air flights sagged. I have a diagram in the book, number of air flights, and then after COVID was over, the thing shot up again. So we've now got huge business of. Tourism is one of the major forms of absorption surplus.
So I have a pivot I'd like to make to something else I wanted to ask you about. It's going to be quite contrived, so bear with me. We were talking about cruise liners and the economics of cruise liners. One of the other things people have been doing with cruise liners in the last 10 years is there's an institute called the Seasteading Institute. And they were a libertarian group who were trying to break away from national regulation, national law, by going out into the open sea where only the law of the sea applies and building islands or building structures out in the sea where they could circumvent labor laws and so on. And of course, it turned out to be very difficult to build structures out in the open sea. And so what they eventually turned to doing when the cruise liner industry started to decline is they bought up lots of cruise ships and placed them in the open ocean and tried to turn them into sort of functioning city-states that would be beyond the rule of any government, where they could do labor exploitation, where they could do science experiments, they could do sort of biotechnology. And I wonder if you have thoughts about this more sort of stable version of that, which is called Prospera, which is the same set of people who basically found this sort of carve-out in Honduras. And this is one aspect of what you very famously call the spatial fix, or the kind of the spatial fragmentation of capitalism, right? The move away from homogenous zones of accumulation towards more and more sort of fragmented organizations of law regulation so that you can pursue different kinds of projects. How should we understand this process of spatial fragmentation inside capitalism?
My introduction to pop music came from listening to those radio stations out in the North Sea.
Right, yes, of course.
Radio Caroline and all the rest of it. I would listen to Top of the Pops on Sundays through this crackling kind of medium. Look, there are a lot of things like this, and there is a way in which abundance, if you want to call it that, and people have surpluses they can put into all kinds of things. The big issue is to what degree can these be mobilizing stations towards the construction of an alternative political economy? And I don't think I see much of an answer to that problem in the things they do. I mean, I like what they're doing, and I think it's fun and all the rest of it, and I'm glad somebody's doing something different. But how to turn it into a form of political economy which can actually meet people's needs at the same time as it does not overexploit labor, overexploit nature, overexploit social relations, and the rest of it. I think that's the problem for me.
I think that's very interesting you say that. The normal, I think, or the classic read from the left of these is that they are essentially modes of capital moving into a new area in order to be able to increase the exploitation of labor, right? So they are this kind of fragmentation rather than the kind of anarchist commune, right? Or the kind of the commune that tries to get beyond the bounds of capital, but instead to become even more deeply exploitative of labor. Maybe we're thinking about different things here. Don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure in certain circumstances that could be the case. But again, this comes back to my notion of a social formation. The kinds of things can go on there, some of which could actually be mobilized in something in a different direction. I mean, there are some ex, uh, explorations of alternative monies and monetary forms, local economic trading systems, and things of that kind. All of which are bedeviled by the whole kind of question of scale, that they work very well all the time. You're just working at a small scale. As soon as you get to, the kind of scale of the current banking system, they have nothing to say.
Yeah, I think there's something very interesting about that as a kind of problem. We definitely talked about this with Marek Pollux, who is one of the theorists we had on last, and he also talks about the same kind of thing that you were talking about with the sort of circulation or the need to make more to make capital valorize or valorize values more quickly, particularly about hedge funds and so on, and this kind of question of the scale of capital and how it sort of becomes elastic and strange and difficult to get a handle on. I want to come to the question, going back to this sort of big diagram over here. Don't worry about all this stuff. Getting back to the kind of the question over here, which is about this diagram. You're, of course, famous as the world's most famous educator in the Marxist tradition. When you started that project, you it wasn't online, and then it got put online, I think, with assistance for graduate students. Is that right? You write about this briefly in the book.
Yeah.
What impact has that had, do you think? And as someone who is also attempting a kind of much more scattered, perhaps, educational project of their own, what have you learned, right, about that process of trying to understand something in a kind of collective and open forum?
Yeah. One of the reasons this could be a bit of diversion. One of the reasons I like working at the metropolitan scale is that Henri Lefebvre suggested we should think about the world in three scales. One is the scale of the local neighborhood and intimacy and all the rest of it. Yeah, the other is the global scale, and then in between is the metropolitan scale. And I like the metropolitan scale because it actually unifies what's happening at the local scale, very local scale, and what's happening at the global. And in that sense, I think that it has much more possibility of routing a path towards an alternative to capital accumulation as the dominant mode of production. Therefore, for that reason, I've always been working at the metropolitan scale. If you work at the local scale, at some point or other, people are going to say, "How do you scale up?" And as soon as you start to scale up, but we have to deal with that all of the time at the metropolitan scale. So I always found that significant, even when I was in my bourgeois phase, if you can call it that, where I was dealing with social justice and talking about how we should discuss that. And of course, you could do that at a global scale, at the neighborhood scale, or the metropolitan scale. And I preferred always to try to work through the social right to the city and all the rest of it at the metropolitan scale, and then think about ways in which challenges could be imagined from the metropolitan scale to the global scale and to deeper understanding of the neighborhood scale. So I've always been very, very concerned with the scale, and of course that's the geographer in me coming out as well, because it's all about space and spatiality and the way in which people start to organize their politics around places. So place has a very important role politically, and if you can start to organize all of those places and spaces where alternatives are actually being sought, then you start to have a political movement. So I've always felt that there was a a tendency to try to dismiss the metropolitan scale as somehow or other not viable. But I think that, for me anyway, the first step towards trying to define an alternative to capital and capital's mode of production would be to work at this metropolitan scale so that we can deal with the issues that arise about the global and the issues that arise about from the neighborhood. So in a sense, it's a kind of a it's always been there. And again, that comes back to my historical geography, and that why was it that capital accumulation uh, concentrated at a certain scale, and this is where my work with Giovanni was very important, because the scale of metropolitan scale is perfect for understanding things like the Italian city-states, and you could start to see how the rise of capital was very much about the organization of this metropolitan scale. And I had a sort of a fantasy about the rise of capital and the role of the urban in the rise of capital, which is studied by quite a few people. And there was once upon a time a Hanseatic League, which was a league of merchant capitalist cities that organized themselves together and made something work. And I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be nice if we had a kind of a league of socialist cities? And in a funny kind of way, what we're seeing right now is Trump going after these cities. So actually, the city is now becoming an instrument of repression and a vital place of political mobilization and political organizing. So it's interesting. You see, back in the 1960s, the crisis of capital was an urban crisis. And we had all the urban uprisings in the 1960s in connection to civil rights movements and feminism and ecology and all the rest of it. So the metropolitan scale is, for me, a very, very important anchor for the things that I'm doing now. It meant different things to me when I was working on that in writing Social Justice in the City. Now the metropolitan scale has become something different. It's become in this current struggles going on, and the way in which Trump is trying to isolate cities and discipline them, and actually the disciplinary apparatus is not there. So there's an active fight going on right now at the metropolitan scale, and that therefore we should think of this not simply as a point of resistance to an awful kind of politics, but to actually say, well, actually, this is identifying the right kind of scale for us to actually go in the other direction. That is, where can we use the metropolitan scale, which I hope is, again, one of the things that's happening with socialists becoming mayors of various cities and so on. Is there a way in which we can put it together and start to actually define an alternative to capital, a capitalist city, by actually saying, look, we can work at these different scales and can test at these different scales and think through the way to create a socialist city.
I guess I think absolutely right about that. And there's the kind of municipal socialism strand of thinking
Yes.
that became very popular actually across the European Union as well. We had
Yes,
a
right.
socialist mayor of Madrid and so on, and that became quite a prominent network in the post-crash era of,
Yes.
of European the
But
European land.
it's interesting. We don't think that this is the path towards the alternative. You know,
But you do.
I do, yeah,
Yeah.
and I would like other people to do so, because yes, somebody becomes mayor of Madrid, somebody becomes mayor of New York, somebody, you know, sets up the People's Republic of Santa Monica or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So these things are going on all of the time, but it's like they just happen to be there. People do them, And it seems it ends there, whereas I think that we can actually start to think about the organization of life, of political and economic and ecological life around the metropolitan scale in such a way that we actually deal with a lot of the global issues. For instance, much of the environmental issue now is a global issue.
Yeah.
And it needs to be addressed, however, and one of the ways to do it is to try to address it at the metropolitan scale. And so by paying attention to how to scale things up and how to scale things down, and to actually see that things like, the City of London, the GLC, things like that, when they happen, these should be actually not just simply things in themselves, but steps towards the actual definition and pursuit of the alternative.
I guess when we're thinking about this spiral, ever increasing accumulation of
Yeah,
capital, it undergoes not only sort of a multi-scalar transformation, right? So you have transformations at the local level and also at the global level simultaneously that relate to each other in this, sort of feedback loop, I guess you could say, or maybe even in moments of sort of dialectical contradiction. But isn't there a way in which the accumulation of capital tends towards a sort of larger and larger scale over time? That means that only at a certain phase of its development is it possible to take the metropolitan scale as the main sort of locus of sort of tension or resistance to the accumulation of capital. At the moment, right, it seems like the main piece of infrastructure that is being constructed in America, and it is a piece of infrastructure, is the development of artificial intelligence. And if you can't really have a sort of single city scale artificial intelligence. I know there are attempts to do this. Francesca Bria, for example, has spoken about this to some extent, but I'm not sure it's entirely kind of possible to have these kind of things because they do genuinely rely on internet scale developments.
right.
And therefore, both the development of them and the resistance to them has to exist at a broader, maybe even global scale, certainly a national scale, when it comes to this kind of question. And so how do you see that process of the spiral obsolescing, or do you see the process, that spiral, obsolescing that particular scale of struggle?
The answer is I don't know. I really don't know quite how the artificial intelligence stuff is going to work out.
Hmm.
I know historically every major innovation has been greeted as the possibility of some sort of grand solution or resolution or whatever, and it's always ended up being turned into an instrument of repression of the mass of the population, either in terms of its wage levels or in terms of its rights and so on. So historically, I would argue that you know, yeah, Marx kind of says it was interesting about John Stuart Mill. He kind of was mesmerized by the fact that machinery, which should lighten the load of labor, had turned into a most vicious system to absolutely repress labor, and he couldn't understand why that was the case. And Marx kind of laughingly kind of says, well, of course it did that because it was the capitalists who developed that technology, and it was bound to be used by the capitalists as a vehicle for the creation and absorption and stealing of surplus capital from people around the world. So I'm not enthusiastic about the artificial intelligence. I'm sure it's going to be used by the billionaire class to sustain itself, and therefore I'm in opposition to it. But at the same time, it is pretty inevitable that this is something that is going to happen. And actually, again, one of the things that's important in the book is that we often attribute technological change to the coercive laws of competition between capitalists, but I think the coercive laws of competition between nation states is just as important. And in fact, right now, what's going on in artificial intelligence is at the state level. It's the Chinese versus the US, right? And
Yeah.
and and you know, so it's not as if I can come in and say, oh, just forget all that artificial intelligence. It's going to be there and it's going to be utilized as part of the military industrial establishment, and it's going to have a lot of civilian uses as well, some of which are going to be progressive and useful, and medicine and so on, and some of which are going to be highly repressive.
I wonder if there's a way of thinking about that state level competition, because I have a question about what might happen when the bubble bursts, right? Because it's very clear that the US government and Trump and JD Vance and the people around him who are increasingly in dialogue with these AI companies, and the AI companies who, possibly because of the difficulty of getting money on the open market because of the unprovenness of technology as a way of generating money, have needed to turn to the state as a sort of investor of last resort. And of course, because there is this dimension of international competition between the US and China, the US sees this as almost existential competition, not dissimilar in its dynamics with the Manhattan Project, right, where with the development of the nuclear bomb, because they see the transformative potential of AI to be so enormous. I think if we see the AI bubble, or if it is indeed a bubble, if we see the AI bubble being pop in the next year, 2 years, then we'll probably enter into a situation where the US government feels compelled to organize a bailout of those industries, because such is the existential importance of that industry for the US's self-conception as an international power, right? And you can imagine the political struggle that will emerge around this, which will combine the sort of Luddite attempts to destroy the thing that is replacing you as a laborer, because that is what artificial intelligence promises to do, with the horror and disgust of the bailouts that took place in 2008, 2009, with the previous financial crisis, where the ruling classes and the bankers and so on are bailed out by the state. And so it seems like a really toxic political cauldron that is being assembled here, if indeed this AI bubble bursts. Does that strike you as a plausible scenario, and how do you think the politics of that might play out?
Yeah, I'm not sure how they play out. As I said in the book, so this whole thing we're moving into has all of the marks of a huge Ponzi scheme. And as such, we know what happens to Ponzi schemes. That somebody at some point or other kind of cries wolf, and bang. How it will? I mean, indebtedness right now, and this is again one of the things, points of the argument I'm trying to make in the book, is that indebtedness didn't arise by accident. It arose out of the fundamental contradictions of capital. And therefore, it is if you like, a continuation of capital by other means. And I'm kind of really concerned about what happens when the Ponzi character of all of the financing and so on comes home to roost. And I think that is, at a certain point, the whole kind of question of what is money. And it's interesting. I mean, all of this stuff with cyber currencies and huge amounts of money pouring into cyber currencies, and you kind of go, "What on earth for? How is this going to work out?" And I'm as mystified as anybody about exactly what the impacts are going to be, and what the ruling class, which itself needs to be redefined, I think, in terms of the billionaire class, because it's essentially a billionaire decision-making structure that lies behind much of what the state is about. The state, in effect, now belongs to the billionaires. And when Giovanni Arrighi says the state is capital, then the state is indeed acting as capital, and as such, it's hard to see how they can get out of the mess that they're currently working. There's going to be almost certainly, in my view, in the next year or two, at least a relatively small shakeout. And when I
Mm.
say relative small, it'll actually be quite huge. But relative to what would be needed, it's a bit like what happened in 2007, 2008. A lot of stuff was put in, but there was nowhere near enough to really solve the problem. And if that is going to be the situation, I really don't know how that Ponzi scheme is going to be, and why, or how it might collapse, and what might be the consequences of its collapse.
I should say for people who are watching, what's on the screen right now is the diagram
Yes,
of all the different deals between the different AI companies. So you can see here that OpenAI, who make ChatGPT, are invested in CoreWeave or vice versa. And then you can see that CoreWeave is invested in NVIDIA, which makes chips. And you can see that NVIDIA is invested in OpenAI. And you have this kind of circular dealing where the money circulates between them. Or, as often the case, not even money circulates between
right.
them. Promises to buy stock in at a certain value, or promises to invest or buy certain numbers of chips, and then of course these are public companies, lots of them, and so the stock price goes up on the announcement of the deal, and then you can use the money from the announcement of the deal, from the rising stock price to actually pay for the deal that you already announced, right? So there's a
Yeah,
strange trickery that can be inserted here. Although I should say, for legal reasons, I am not alleging that anyone has done anything illegal. So just to be absolutely clear, I do want to ask about my last question. I want to ask about the tension here between artificial intelligence and capitalism as a whole, because there might be something here. Namely, that if we take the basic Marxist idea that surplus value derives from labor, and the capacity of labor to produce something more, right, at the end of the day than was there at the beginning, and we say that lots of labor will be replaced by AI, but it will not be surplus value producing and therefore won't be able to produce systemically profit. Is there a tension between the fraction of capital that is invested in AI and the fraction of capital that uses AI, who will be, if the Marxist theory holds, accidentally driving down their own profits because they will be producing less surplus value if they replace labor with machinery? I think the argument that I'm trying to make
yes,
goes
yeah,
something like labor power is the source of surplus value. Surplus value is to some extent like a matter of it's how capitalists get profits, right? If AI companies sell to other capitalists their AI, they're essentially selling a kind of machinery, right? But a machinery that does lots of the productivity of an individual laborer. It replaces the laborer. And therefore, because that increases the organic composition of capital, by selling or by replacing workers with machinery, capitalists are undercutting their own capacity to make a profit.
yes. There are contradictions all over the place. Yeah, so that's and which will win out and why is kind of very much on the table right now. But again, what you're dealing with is not only a competition between capitalists; it's a competition between nation states,
Yeah.
and that is powered by the necessity of technological innovation to provide military advantage.
Mm.
So, as I see it, at a certain point, the question is going to be who's going to come up with a superior technological mix which is going to turn that advantage into a system of domination. And this is where, I mean, what is it that's driving all of these companies, and what is it that's driving the state, the military establishments and so on to do the kinds of things that they could do in Venezuela, for example.
Mm.
And then Trump is obviously now believes he can do almost anything. or his vehicle, i.e., the U.S. military, can do almost anything, and that may be wrong. I mean, if that whole episode of Venezuela had ended up like the one that happened with Iran under the Carter administration, we would be in a completely different world.
This is the beginning of Delta Force, right? The secretive sort of elite squad inside the
Yeah.
JSOC,
So
who crashed a plane.
so I
Crashed a
think
helicopter, yeah.
so I think a lot of the monetary stuff at somehow or other is secondary to the military advantage stuff. That's where I would look, and I think that there are other things which are where the capitalist class has started to utilize. I mean, I mentioned urbanization and stupid urbanization projects and so on. So there's plenty of that around. But you know, what's so weird is everybody is going around preaching austerity at a time of superabundance. And the superabundance could be utilized in decent ways for the mass of the population that's actually trying to get by on almost nothing. I mean, it is extraordinary when you think of it. I mean, here's the United States with all of its wealth and power and all the rest of it, and half of the population is trying to get by on about $30,000 a year. And you kind of go, this is just absurd. And I don't think the artificial intelligence is going to be used to remedy that situation.
Perhaps not.
It's going to have to come from somewhere else. And I don't know quite where it is. I think actually the alternative currencies are kind of, I think this is just the fly-by-night thing, and it's likely to disappear in 3 or 4 years, but we'll see.
Thank you very much. David Harvey, thank you for coming on Do Your Own Research.
Well, thank you very much for the conversation. It gives me a great deal of pleasure that you at least got something out of the book. I think that's terrific. I'm glad.
Yes,
I hope that people can use it right, because each chapter is relatively short and doesn't cover everything, and people should do a lot of work to go further with it.
Yeah. Yes, it's incredibly clear and actually extremely easy to read, I would say. This is...
Oh, good. Yeah. Good. That was the holy grail I was looking for.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Right. Thank you.